Well, welcome everybody. This is Michael Roberts Talks To, another little session that I've been having during the year of the COVID with different Marxists and other socialists around the world on different subjects during 2020. And now we're into 2021. I thought this is an opportunity for us perhaps to discuss a very important Marxist economist, Henryk Grossman, and the expert on this, the biographer of Grossman, the man who has published just about everything that Grossman has produced and continues to provide interesting and deep analysis of Grossman's work. Rick Kuhn joins me here from Australia. Rick used to be a lecturer at the Australian National University, and he's an editor of Class and Struggle, an Australian journal, and is a well-known and long-standing activist in the labour movement in Australia. But on this occasion, his most important contribution, as far as I'm concerned, is his expertise on explaining the ideas and work and methods of Henryk Grossman. So greetings, Rick, from to you in Australia. And to kick off,
Hi,
perhaps
Michael.
you could just tell us who was Henryk Grossman for those who don't know.
Right, well, I'll try and keep this brief because I could go on for quite a while. Henryk Grossman was born in 1881 in Krakow in the Austrian-occupied partition of Poland. He was born to a well-off Jewish family which was in the process of assimilating to Polish high culture. He was involved in the Polish Social Democratic Party of Galicia while he was in high school, and at university he associated with members of other socialist organisations in the Congress Kingdom of Poland, which was the Russian-occupied partition, and he also organised Jewish workers in Krakow and more broadly in Galicia into trade unions and political associations affiliated with the Polish Social Democratic Party. Eventually, he became the founding theoretician and secretary of the Jewish Social Democratic Party of Galicia, which split from the PPSD because the PPSD was really thoroughly neglecting Jewish workers. The Jewish Social Democratic Party, though, immediately applied for affiliation to the general Austrian Social Democratic Party. Grossman went to Vienna after studying in Krakow to work under Karl Grünberg, who was the first professor, Marxist professor at any German-speaking university. And he worked there on Galician economic history. During the war, he was called up. And also, it seems during the war, he began to work on Marxist economic theory. After the war, he went to Warsaw. He was constrained to leave Vienna because he was deemed not to be worthy of Austrian citizenship by the coalition government dominated by Social Democrats in Rump, Austria. He went to Warsaw, became a senior official of the Central Statistical Office, and also joined the Communist Workers' Party of Poland. And this reflected something of a political shift because his politics had essentially been those of the Jewish Bund before that, but he was won over to Leninist politics by the Russian Revolution. He went into a kind of qualified exile in Frankfurt am Main in Germany in 1925. And that's where he did his most influential work. He went to Frankfurt to be the assistant of Karl Grünberg, who had become the first director of the Institute for Social Research, which was where the Frankfurt School, so-called, was born. In 1929, The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown of the Capitalist System, being also a theory of crisis, was published. That was certainly his most influential work. When the Nazis were handed power by the German ruling class, he went to Paris, then London, and then New York, where he lived from 1937 until 1949, when he took up a chair at the University of Leipzig in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany, which soon became the German Democratic Republic, the Stalinist German Democratic Republic. He died in 1950, and it's worth noting that none of his works were ever republished in communist German Democratic Republic. And that's because his account of Marxist economic theory did not accord with that of Stalin's lieutenant in economics, that is Jeno or Eugen or Yevgeny Varga, who was a Hungarian who went into exile in Russia after the Hungarian Revolution of 1919.
How did you come across Henryk Grossman, Rick? When was the first time you noticed his works? How did that come about? Do you know?
In an excellent article by Anwar Sheikh, published in a reader that was issued by the Review of Radical Political Economics in the United States. And Anwar Sheikh's article is a brief history of Marxist crisis theory, which
crisis theory
vindicates Grossman's position.
Yeah.
So I read about him there in the early 1980s, and eventually when I could read German in a systematic way at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, I explored Grossman some more. His Law of Accumulation book was published in an abridged form in the early 1990s. That was quite a good abridgment, except for the fact that it doesn't include the concluding chapter, which is quite important. And the person who did the abridgment, Jairus Banerjee, and I have produced a full translation, which should be published later on this year in the Historical Materialism book series. That translation not only has the conclusion, but other sections of the book which were deleted in the course of the abridgment.
So if you, well, I'm going to ask, what do you think was Grossman's main contribution to Marxist economic theory in your view? That's a big answer to make, but I'm leaving you to try.
Well, Grossman essentially recovered and elaborated on Marx's crisis theory. And that was really quite crucial. And that was based on a recognition of the economic importance of the use value aspect of commodities, which had been neglected by previous Marxists who'd worked on economic theory and in particular on crisis theory. So I think that's really crucial. Grossman also published revealing accounts of the history of political economy and the emergence of the modern scientific worldview from the 15th to the 17th century. So some distance away from Marxist economic theory, but he made important breakthroughs in that area as well, which paralleled those of the Russian Boris Hessen, who worked in the 1920s and the 1930s. So I think those are his most important contributions.
So my impression is that when I read Grossman's work, I'm so stunned by how clear it makes it to me to understand, and I say that to the viewers now, to understand Marx's theory of crisis, because two things. First, before Grossman, it seemed to me total confusion amongst the epigones of Marx and Engels about just what causes crises under capitalism, with different alternative theories coming up and not really coherent. And since Grossman, I have to say in the very recent period, we also have a confused view as well where in a way people argue that Marx has no theory of crisis at all, or it was an unfinished theory and so on. It seems to me Grossman solves those two issues, both from the past and now.
I think that that's absolutely correct. And he also provided the first explanation of the structure of capital, which is important if you want to understand what Marx was bloody on about in Capital and the importance of crisis theory in it. Grossman talked about Marx engaging in an Annäherungsverfahren, or a process of successive approximation. So what Marx does in Capital throughout the 3 volumes is to start with at a very high level of abstraction, and then which brackets out less important aspects of reality, and then successively reintroduces complicating factors of the real world to bring the analysis, the model, closer to concrete reality. And while Marx already foreshadows towards the end of volume 1 his breakdown theory, it's in volume 3 at a more concrete level of analysis that he engages in a far more detailed discussion of capitalism's crisis tendency, its breakdown tendency, based on capitalism's tendency for the rate of profit to fall.
So what do you think was the, how can I put it, the key contribution that he makes in explaining crisis theory from a Marxist terms compared to alternatives that have been offered?
Well, for Grossman, following Marx, economic crises are generated by a contradiction at the very heart of capitalist production. Crises do not arise fundamentally from problems in the distribution of capital or the consumption of commodities. So Grossman had a critique of underconsumptionist theories, which identify crises as most importantly resulting from problems with realising surplus value and inability to sell the commodities that have been produced, and also a critique of disproportionality theory. That is, ideas that crises arise because the levels of production in different industries don't match together sufficiently. For Grossman, that's this contradiction at the heart of capitalist production is also a contradiction between use value and exchange value. On the one hand, capitalism has the capacity to produce all sorts of use values in vast quantities capable of satisfying human needs. And what's more, the dynamic of capitalism, that is competitive accumulation, competitive investment in newer technologies in order to produce more cheaply, in order to undercut rivals, that dynamic revolutionises production, dramatically increases the productivity of human labour on a relatively consistent basis over prolonged periods of time. Just think about the amount of human labour that went into harvesting wheat at the beginning of the 19th century, where you do it with a sickle, compared with something that's fairly important for Australian agricultural industry, the combine harvester. The amount of human labour going into producing 1 kilo of unprocessed wheat then and now, it's just a staggering difference. And we can also talk about the consequences of digital technology in revolutionising the productivity of human labour. So that's a wonderful aspect of capitalism. But on the other hand, that very process itself leads to an increase in the level of outlays on what Marx calls dead labour, constant capital, means of production, machinery, equipment, and so on, and also the inputs into the production of commodities, dramatic increases in the levels of investment in those aspects of production compared with the outlays on living labour. But it's only living labour that creates new value. And this is what underpins the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So on the one hand, capitalism is fantastically productive, and on the other hand, the very mechanism that leads to that productivity undermines the dynamic of capitalism, which is the pursuit of profit. So there you have the foundation of Marx's breakdown theory and his theory of economic crises.
Now, a lot of people say, Rick, that the law of the tendency rate of profit to fall is either irrelevant to understanding crises, there are alternatives, or that it's really a long-term theory about slowly capitalism coming to an end over a long period of time as profitability falls. It's not anything to do with crises. Rosa Luxemburg described the law, the tendency rate of profit fall, as about as useful as waiting for the sun to burn out. It was going to take so long to be relevant to crises. I don't think Grossman would have agreed with that, would he? Or he didn't?
No, nor Marx for that matter. And it's important to highlight that both Marx and Grossman identified the tendency for the rate of profit to fall and counter tendencies that are also built into the capitalist mode of production. Because, for example, the very process that cheapens commodities, that is, reduces the amount of labour that goes into producing individual commodities, does that for the commodities that constitute constant capital. It cheapens constant capital as well, and that slows down the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It also cheapens the value of labour power, which generates living labour. And by cheapening the cost of production of food and clothing and accommodation and so on. That also slows down the process. However, in the longer term, it is very clear that the organic composition of capital, the ratio of dead labour to living labour in the production process, in value terms, to the extent that it reflects changes in the technical composition of capital, the use value ratios of machinery and equipment compared with living human workers, that does rise. And what Grossman argues is that at particular points in the accumulation of capital, the rise in the organic composition of capital is such that the rate of profit is too low to promote further accumulation. And that generates an economic crisis. And the economic crisis itself is part of a counteracting tendency. Because in the course of an economic crisis, significant chunks of capital are devalued. They are either junked altogether, or I think probably more commonly, they are sold off cheap by bankrupt companies. And those corporations or companies that buy these devalued means of production have lower costs because they've got these means of production much more cheaply. And therefore their rate of profit increases. So this is an important mechanism through which economic crises can rejuvenate capitalism, restore the rate of profit to some extent.
So Rick, Henryk doesn't have a breakdown theory. He uses the word breakdown as the nature of the crisis. People have said, have accused him of, well, you've just got an idea that capitalism goes to a point, it collapses, breaks down, and that's the end of it. And that's all we have to wait for. That's not what Grossman is saying, is it?
No, it's not what he's saying. He's talking about capitalism having a breakdown tendency, and sometimes he's a bit loose with his language. But he's talking about an overall tendency, and one that sees a long-term secular decrease in the rate of profit, punctuated by economic crises. So Grossman didn't have some mechanical theory of economic breakdown.
Yeah.
The idea that capitalism would collapse of its own accord. I
often get a question from people and they say, is the Marxist theory of crisis a secular theory or a cyclical one? My reply is it's both. The process of the tendency is driving down the rate of profit. The counter tendencies are holding that back. At a certain point, there is a crisis. And then, as you say, the crisis creates conditions for a new movement of profitability. But I would argue that each stage is getting more difficult for capitalism to progress the productive forces on the basis of this contradiction between the use value and exchange value. So in that sense, there is no permanent crisis, but the crisis will to get extensively worse over a period of, well, longer than human lifespan maybe, but certainly that's the way I see it. It's both secular and cyclical.
Yes, I think that's right. And Grossman was very explicit, both in private communications and manuscripts that he wrote, but also in his published work before his big, most influential book, in the course of that book, and subsequently, that capitalism would not collapse of its own accord, and that it was necessary for the working class to take political action to bring it down, to smash it, to bring about a revolution. And he made references to Lenin as a key authority in revolution and how capitalism would be ended. He's quite explicit about this. So the idea that he had a mechanical theory of breakdown, which is quite widespread, is based on really very slack reading of his work, and is a distortion of the arguments that Grossman, who was committed to working class self-emancipation through revolution, the arguments that he actually made. I'll also say that Grossman's politics weren't perfect in all respects. So he, at various stages, was effectively politically a Stalinist. But he never resiled from his economic theory, despite the fact that it fell foul of Stalin's hench person or hench thing in economics, Jeno Varga. Grossman was committed to that, and subjectively was committed to the concept of the working class liberating itself through
exactly. It
revolution.
Seems to me that Marxist theory is saying, look, we can have the subjective desire to change the world and get socialism, get rid of capitalism, but the objective conditions have to be there as well. On the other hand, you can have the objective conditions, but if you don't have the subjective factor, you won't bring about the change. The two are dialectically connected, and that the idea that you can have either a mechanistic economic breakdown theory, and that's the end of it, or on the other hand, some sort of voluntarist drive to change, win the class struggle without having the objective conditions there to do so, seems to me a mistake that people make on each side. And to accuse Grossman of being on one side, I think, is unfair.
Quite. Well, I think that you and I belong to a significant quartet in that respect, with Henryk and Karl. Well, actually, it's probably a quintet. I'd put Freddie in there as well, emphasising that, well, certainly my role in this quintet is a very, very minor one.
I want to ask another aspect, which is imperialism is still right on the agenda as far as I'm concerned, will increasingly be in the 21st century.
Yes.
Rosa Luxemburg is famous for her approach to trying to explain why there was imperialism, her argument being that it was capitalism was forced to look for markets because it had couldn't sell its goods at home. It needed to export those goods and export the capital to what we used to call the third world or the global south, and to take that as a market. I think Grossman also makes a very important contribution on imperialism, because going from Lenin, he says it's not a question of trying to find markets, it's a question of trying to counteract the falling profitabilities existing in the major economies. And so there is a move towards applying the export of capital, increasing the organic composition of capital elsewhere, and taking advantage of unequal exchange, the surplus you can get out of having an advantage technologically over the global south. I'm doing some work on it at the moment, Rick, and the empirical evidence confirms the view that Marx had and that Grossman has, that the transfer of value takes place in one of the important areas through the unequal exchange in trade, because of the desperate attempts of imperialism to try and keep profitability up by expanding international trade and investment, not just to get a market to sell goods.
I think that's right, and that's one aspect of Grossman's account of imperialism, where I think he made very important and original contributions. And I think it's important to distinguish that argument about unequal exchange from those who argue that unequal exchange means that workers in the developed world are bought off by the proceeds of unequal exchange. I think that that's entirely wrong. Grossman had another argument about imperialism, and that is that it was the pursuit of effectively monopolistic advantages over rivals. So if you can gain access to especially cheaper raw materials by means of territorial control, in the case of the older imperialism, colonial imperialism, or by what one might call neo-colonialism, or just the operations of the foreign policies, trade policies and aid policies of governments, if you can gain control of cheap raw materials or access to cheap labour, then this gains you a monopolistic advantage compared with your rivals. So imperialism is as much or even more about the competition between the imperialist powers in terms of its dynamic as it is about the relationship between the imperialist powers and those who are prey to them.
Yeah. One other area that strikes me in some of the publications that you've made of Grossman's work was his emphasis on the question of a critique of mainstream economics. Its idea that everything is in harmony or goes towards general equilibrium, that there is no concept of a dynamic process or an uneven development in capitalism, which Henryk Grossman spends quite a bit of time going through the works of mainstream economists and others to explain the difference between the Marxist dynamic approach and the general equilibrium approach of mainstream economics.
Yes, yeah, in what was effectively a monograph, Marx, Classical Political Economy and the Problem of Dynamics, Grossman made a pioneering contribution, certainly not the first, but a very important contribution to the critique of mainstream marginalist economics. And he argued there, as others had before, that mainstream economics confuses use value and value, or exchange value. He emphasised that underpinning bourgeois economics, vulgar political economy, since the early 19th century was, well, and even actually not just vulgar political economy, but also classical political economy of Smith and Ricardo, is the idea of equilibrium, that economies tend towards an equilibrium state of harmonious growth of their own accord, if they're not interfered with. And Grossman argued that this simply was not the case, that there is no equilibrium tendency under capitalism. For example, in response to declining demand and therefore prices and profits, mainstream economics says, well, output would decrease and the economy would be brought back into equilibrium. But actually, in practice, capitalists may increase production in response to declining demand in order to try and sell more to make up for the profits that have been lost because of falling prices, and also to drive their rivals out of business. So the tendency here is not towards equilibrium, but for a certain period anyway, towards a heightening of the problems and the generation of economic crisis. I think this is quite a powerful kind of argument. And Grossman also pointed out that the use value aspect of commodities entails the way in which real commodities have specific material features, and those material features include a time element, the amount of time it takes to produce them. Whereas mainstream neoclassical economics these days have a simultaneous approach. That is, they assume that everything happens all at once, and that's how equilibrium is established.
Time doesn't exist.
Yes, exactly, exactly. The inputs and outputs, they appear at the same time.
Yeah.
And Grossman emphasised, well, actually the real world isn't like that, and we can appreciate that pretty easily, I think. And the absence of this time element, this aspect of the use value feature of commodities, really undermines the analysis of mainstream economics. That is, without the time element, there is really no dynamics in mainstream economics. Their theory is static. It may not always be labelled that way, but because of the absence of the time element, it is essentially static theory. And efforts to overcome that within the framework of highly abstract, well, I'll put it this way, within the framework of the religion of mainstream economics, have not succeeded, despite the incredible levels of mathematical sophistication that are employed to baffle the uninitiated.
Well, I know that those who are students of economics in universities, if anybody watches this or lectures, will only just agree with you there when they have to wade through the formula presented in most of these papers, which seems to be the condition of producing a paper. I always jump to the conclusion to see exactly what they actually come up with at the end, and sometimes it's a bit of a disappointment. But what isn't a disappointment is your book here. This is many years ago, your biography of Grossman, Recovery of Marxism, which I recommend to all the viewers. It's a tremendous book. But as you were saying earlier, Rick, you've been working through all the publications of Grossman. What have we got coming up again, if you remind us, this year and maybe beyond? Well,
the 4-volume works that I have been editing and introducing won't include absolutely everything. It doesn't include the stuff about the emergence of modern scientific perspectives or some of his works on statistics. And there are also some manuscripts that aren't included. So, but it is all of the published works that deal directly with economics that I could find, and also some manuscript material and correspondence. So what's been published so far is a collection of articles, correspondence, and a couple of monographs on economic theory. That came out early last year and in paperback, and in affordable paperback much more recently with Haymarket. What's recently been published is the second volume, which is Grossman's works, which are primarily political, dealing with political topics. The third volume will be Jairus Banerjee and my translation of The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown. And the fourth volume will be some works by Grossman on economic history. The bulk of it dealing with really the period of the emergence of capitalism in Galicia in the 18th century, but also some other shorter pieces as well. And well, I've already submitted that for copy editing, but the process of getting that back is taking some time. I'm also waiting for the page proofs of The Law of Accumulation somewhat impatiently.
Well, this is a familiar story to me anyway. I sometimes wonder if I'm not going to be dead before some things get published.
I have those concerns too.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, for giving us some...
Can I add one thing, Michael?
Yes, of course.
And that is that there's no one-to-one mapping of a person's economic theory to their politics or vice versa.
Yeah.
They can be in contradiction with one another. But the power of political and economic analyses are far greater when they are consistent and coherent. That was a fundamental strength of the Marxism developed by Karl and Fred, but it was distorted in the theory and practice of most parties of the Second International. In the biography of Grossman that you generously mentioned, I argue that in the context of the Bolshevik Party and the early communist movement, Lenin, Georgy Lukács and Grossman restored that strength in respectively Marxist politics, philosophy and economics. And their recoveries of Marxism, I think, together provide a sound, though by no means infallible basis for the practice of working class self-emancipation and integration of economic analysis with political analysis, both of which are a guide to working class self-emancipation.
Yes, well, I'm sure viewers take that in, and thank you very much, Rick, for giving us only a short account of all the work you've done about Henryk Grossman, but also I think it'll whet the appetite for the books coming up, but also, certainly for me anyway, but also perhaps for viewers who haven't come across Grossman before. This is an opportunity to, I think, really enrich your understanding of Marxist political economy, because he's a key figure in the 20th century, and we need his contribution greatly as we go into this 21st century. Thanks again, Rick.
My pleasure.